Good afternoon, everybody. This is Alex Barthet with the Barthet Construction Law Firm. It is 12 o'clock. So that means we are going to go ahead and get started with today's Miami Construction Forum. As you all know, we meet monthly, having a different guest speaker every month, talking about different issues relevant to the construction industry, specifically the Miami construction industry. Today's no different. We have with us Phil Gross. Phil is with Furman Insurance. He has been in the insurance business for a very long time, focusing his book of business on construction and those in the local construction market. As we do with every presentation, at the end, within a few days, Narcy in my office, she will send everyone a list of everyone that signed up, plus a copy of the PowerPoint, as well as a link to the video of today's presentation. So no need to feverishly write notes, because we'll send that out to you within a few days. So with that, Phil, I'm going to turn it over to you and let us all know about the things we didn't know we needed to know about with insurance for our construction business.
All right, thanks for the introduction, Alex, and appreciate the opportunity to speak to the Miami Construction Forum. Thanks to you and Patrick, and also welcome to the Miami-Dade chapter of the CFMA. So before I get started, I just wanted to let everyone know I try and make all my presentations to a group is involved with all the participants as possible. However, it's a little bit difficult when we're using Zoom. So we're going to ask you to do, if you have any questions while I'm doing the presentation, to make it interactive, is to send Alex in the Q&A box your question or comment, and he will see if he can chime in. And of course, there'll be plenty of time at the end for questions as well. So I'll get started then. So thanks for the introduction, Alex. As you said, I'm with Furman, Phil Gross with Furman Insurance. We do focus on construction companies, GCs, subcontractors, and trying to help them manage their risk, lower their operating expenses, and protect the assets of the company. So that's our main focus for our clients. So you can go to the next slide, please. So before I get into the actual meat and potatoes of the presentation, which is construction exclusions on the general liability policy, I wanted to just first cover, so everyone's on the same page, what the actual general liability policy is intended to cover. So basically, the intent of the policy is to cover for bodily injury and property damage for which you, the insured, are legally liable. And big end to which this insurance applies. So I'm going to get to that a little bit later, because that's a broad promise, a broad statement, legally liable for damages for bodily injury and property damage. However, it doesn't apply in every single situation, thus the need for limitations and/or exclusions, which will be the body of my presentation. It then goes on to explain the definition of bodily injury and property damage. And basically, that is what the coverage is limited to. So that has to be part of the claim, part of the situation that's potentially leading to a claim. Next slide, please. So again, to further just get a basic understanding of what the general liability policy covers and how it works is, in order for there to be coverage, there needs to be what's called a trigger. So the trigger is basically an occurrence where something has happened to cause bodily injury or property damage. And that bodily injury or property damage must occur during the policy period. So for instance, right now, today is April 21st, 2021. If your policy started on January 1st, 2021, you would be in that policy period from January 1st, 2021 to January 1st, 2022. So if something were to happen tomorrow, that's within, the occurrence happened within that policy period. So that would be the policy that the trigger would have to occur within. And then lastly, the policy, almost all policies will provide defense. There are some times where there's a limitation. So the insurer is promising to provide defense for you as part of the coverage. However, there are instances where the trigger, whether or not there's actually legal liability on your part, is unknown at the beginning of a claim. So sometimes they will do something called an ROR, reservation of rights letter, where they will assign an adjuster, do an investigation, and then determine if there is, on their part, an obligation to provide the defense and provide coverage. So basically, in a nutshell, the GL policy is there to protect you for bodily injury and property damages based on the terms and conditions in that policy and to which it applies, which that leads to the guts of the presentation. And the next slide, please, which are the exclusions and/or limitations. So I'm going to talk in two different sections about exclusions. The first section, which I have here, are exclusions that are common to pretty much every single general liability policy out there. There's a list of about 17 of those exclusions. I've only listed 5 here because these are the 5 that are most commonly come into play with a construction firm: GC, subcontractor, trade contractor. So the first of these is contractual liability. And on the next slide, I'll go over what that pertains to and give you an example. So obviously, I'm pretty sure everyone on this call is familiar with the lengthy construction contracts that you often have to enter into at the beginning or prior to beginning a project. There's usually a host of sections, some of which have to do with payment, performance, the scope of work. I'm going to narrow in on the contractual liability of what's covered and what's not covered. So, for instance, in that contract, there may be a clause in there that you are liable if you don't finish the project on time, liquidated damages. That is a liability on the part of you who signed the contract, and you may have to at some point pay the person that you're performing the job for because you weren't able to fulfill the job in the time frame that was required. There's other provisions in the contract about causing damage and indemnification. So this contractual liability exclusion basically limits the policy of how it would respond to anything only pertaining to, again, bodily injury and property damage. I know I'm going to probably sound like a broken record a little bit, but that's the key, is always bodily injury or property damage. So for example, a few weeks back, I got a call from one of my GCs, and he's like, look, I want to place a claim on our general liability. We hired this roofer. He was about halfway through the job, and they decided they were closing the doors. They've been in business for a very long time, this roofer, and they're not going to be able to finish the job. They left the job site on Friday. This is a call on Monday morning. And I'm going to have to now hire someone to go and finish the job that they left half done. It's going to cost me a lot more money, and I want to make a claim. Well, I had to explain to him that you can't make a claim on your general liability because there's no bodily injury or property damage caused due to their work. If there was a surety bond or some other remedy to that situation, that might work, but your general liability policy, again, is only going to respond to if there was bodily injury or property damage caused. So there's other clauses in the contract that you agree to, like I mentioned, whether it be liquidated damages or some other clause where you may have some financial remuneration you have to make under the policy. But the only time the GL will cover you in a contract is, for the most part, there is one other instance we're going to cover in a moment, is if there's bodily injury or property damage. The next common exclusion is workers' compensation. So again, most contractors, GC, some contractors are going to have a separate policy for workers' compensation. In the state of Florida, that's actually supposed to be the sole remedy for an employee's injuries, their medical and lost time. There are some exceptions to that, which comes under the heading that I have on the next slide, please. The workers' compensation employer's liability. So there is in most contracts an indemnification clause when you are working for someone else, a GC or an owner, where you may have to indemnify them, make them whole if they get sued for work that you were involved in. So for instance, what happened several times in the last few years, an employee for a subcontractor got hurt. They got seriously hurt, I should say. Sometimes even a fatality, God forbid. The employee or the employee's family can make a suit under the workers' comp policy, which is very difficult to prove, called employer's liability. So most of the time, they don't even try to go down. The lawyers and the injured employee or the injured employee's family don't necessarily going to have success going after the employer's liability. So they go after the upstream contractor. Could be FPL, could be AT&T, could be whoever you're working for, Moss Construction, and they go and sue that upstream contractor. And then the upstream contractor says, well, this was due to, your gross negligence or your negligence. You have to indemnify us because they're now suing us. And so that is an exception to contractual liability because you, in that contract, agree to indemnify the person who you're performing the work for. So there's very limited exceptions to the contractual liability, but there is some coverage based on bodily injury and property damage for contractual liability in the GL policy. So that covers the first two. The next slide, please. We're going to just talk for the first time about pollution. I'm going to get back to that a little later. So like I said, all common GL policies in common exclude pollution. And this is the ISO or the standard version of that limitation to coverage, which if you want to read through this, there are some instances where they actually will provide some coverage for pollution. So they actually, in almost every single GL policy in a contractor, will put on a separate pollution exclusion, which I'm going to get to in the next section. So just be aware of pollution is excluded. And the reason why this is excluded, and one of the next exclusions I'm going to talk about, professional liability, are excluded, is because the intent is for coverage to be found elsewhere on another policy. So I'm not sure, depending upon what type of contractor you are, a subcontractor, you may or may not have a separate policy for pollution liability, but that is the general intent of this exclusion, is for the policy to not have coverage under your GL, for the insured not to have coverage under the GL policy, but to purchase a separate policy for pollution liability. And we'll go over in depth what that actually means in terms of what a pollution liability policy would cover and a pollution event is. So the last two common policy exclusions that pertain to construction clients. Next slide, please, Alex. The damage to your product and damage to your work. So this is one of the most confusing things about a general liability policy, that most people, whether they be in construction or just a lay person, let's say the owner of a house or the board of a condominium, they don't quite understand this exclusion. So a lot of times that'll lead to lawsuits, and there may or may not be coverage based on what damage resulted. So the intent of this exclusion is to limit the GL policy to damage that your work caused. So for instance, if a stucco carrier did a poor job or used the wrong ingredient, the wrong type of stucco, didn't apply it properly, and then, a week later, a month later, after they left the job, there was water intrusion from the exterior of the building that leaked into the condo unit and the 4 condo units below them and caused damage to the drywall and other contents in the building. The damage that the water intrusion caused would be covered, but the repair of the actual stucco work that the contractor did. So if they, did a 20-story condo and they did a poor job in the actual installation of that stucco and it all had to be replaced, the entire stucco job, there would be no coverage under the contractor's GL policy for the replacement of the stucco work. However, the damage that resulted due to their poor workmanship would be covered. So basically what the GL policy is saying is we are not we're not here to provide a warranty for the subcontractor's work, but we will provide coverage for the damage that their poor work caused. And then the last one that's common to all GL policies is professional liability. Again, the intent of this is there should be professional liability policy somewhere else if you have that exposure, which is a very sometimes not clear question, because we have started to see over the last 5 or 10 years, many GCs and especially many municipalities start to request professional liability of subcontractors that really don't have a true professional liability exposure. What I mean by that is they're not a design build firm, they're not using an architect, but they may be some elements of design. So for instance, if you're an HVAC contractor and you're participating in where the ducts are going to go and how the air is going to flow through the building, and that may cause certain parts of the building to not be warm enough and be too warm and cause other damage or cause some bodily injury to people because of the flow of the air. You were involved into the initial design of how that was constructed. The GL policy could say this is not covered because you gave input, you were involved in the design of the original construction. So there could be an instance where you would need professional liability. There's even instances where someone may give advice like, well, we provide, let's say, a roof coating, and the roof coating company salesperson says, well, this is how you have to mix it, and these are the tools, and this is how it has to be applied. And he didn't realize that they were applying it over a certain surface that needed a different type of mixture or different type of tools to do that. And he was given advice that could also potentially be considered professional giving advice liability. So those are the 5 main exclusions to every GL policy that apply to construction firms. So I'm going to stop here, see if anyone has any questions they wanted to submit to Alex for that section of the presentation. See how we're doing here on time. Okay.
Phil, I'm going to jump in here. There's no pending questions, and maybe you're going to get to this later. Do you have some recommendations on additional coverages that would account for some of these gaps?
Yes. So when I get to the pollution, I was going to talk to that more so than anything else. But that's a good question in itself, actually, Alex, because some of the exclusions, and when we get to more specific exclusions in the next section, you can go to the next slide, you'll see what I mean. There really is no recommendations beyond to try and not have these exclusions on your policy where possible. So for instance, yeah, you can recommend purchasing a pollution policy or professional liability policy, but in terms of what I spoke about a few moments ago, in terms of damage to your work, there's very limited products out there to provide a warranty to your work. So some contractors do provide a warranty, and some have like an upsell warranty where, we're installing this HVAC unit and we'll warranty our work for 1 year. You can buy a service contract and it'll extend the warranty, maybe of the actual HVAC unit itself or just of the work that they performed. But the insurance policy itself, especially on those 5 exclusions that are common to all GL policies, there's really nothing beyond buying a pollution policy and nothing beyond buying a professional liability policy that would cover those exclusions.
Let me ask one question, Phil. What about an inland marine policy to cover maybe rental equipment? Is that something that you see?
Well, rental equipment. So the inland marine policy is a property policy. It's first party coverage. And so if you will, any property that's located at your premise would normally, and doesn't leave your premise, it would normally be scheduled on the property policy itself. However, something that would leave the policy, that's the purpose of the inland marine, is something like a forklift or some other mobile equipment that you could schedule on the inland marine policy so that you might have coverage. But again, this is bodily injury or property damage to your property, which would be covered except if it was an exclusion that we're going to talk about. So yeah, you would always have first party coverage if you had property coverage. It's just, you are then, going to be the one, your policy is responding, not the person that you hired, the subcontractor or the GC.
Right. I guess my question is, if I'm routinely renting a Bobcat, an excavator, to forklifts, other heavy equipment, do you typically see that your clients would get an inland marine to cover those? Or I guess they could buy the insurance from the rental company.
Right. So there's 2 parts to the coverage for mobile equipment like that. You have the property coverage, which you're right, you would either purchase directly from the equipment rental company, or if you have your own inland marine policy, you would have coverage potentially under leased and rented equipment. That's for the first party coverage. You would still need to have coverage. This GL policy in general will cover the liability. And as a matter of fact, the equipment rental company will also want proof that you have liability coverage for their piece of equipment that they own that you're renting.
Right.
So that is covered unless it's excluded under the GL policy. So if you're renting an excavator, some other type of mobile equipment, even potentially a crane, could be covered under the GL policy.
Okay, great. Well, I'll let you get back to the construction specific exclusions.
Right. So these I picked out of a list of probably like 20 or 30 exclusions. So it's not meant to cover everything out there, but these are the ones that we run into the most often and run into problems either with certificate requests and or claims. So there's a list here of 8 of these exclusions. I'm going to cover them kind of one by one. So the residential exclusion, townhomes. So the bigger picture, next slide, please. The bigger picture is residential exclusions on GL policies. South Florida is unfortunately a haven for construction defect claims. So over the last 5 or 10 years, the underwriters have gotten a lot stricter in their underwriting and often will put on various types of residential exclusions onto a GL policy with the intent to be they don't want to cover certain types of residential projects. So I'm going to give example, I think, of 3 or 4 examples here of what's typically not covered, but it doesn't run the whole gamut. You could actually have a GL policy that has no residential exclusion, and one that has 100%, you can't do any residential exclusion, whether it's new construction or service and repair. So the first one here on the left is newly constructed residential housing. And then it defines what that is, and it actually gives a give back of coverage for apartments, and it defines what an apartments are. And it's talking about newly constructed residential property. Why is this important if you're hiring someone to do work for you? Because if you are constructing a brand new, a custom home, this may limit or eliminate any coverage that they have for that project. If they have this type of exclusion on there, someone, either your agent or your attorney, needs to review what the exclusion is for the residential construction. Most of these allow you to do repair and service, most of these residential exclusions. So for instance, on the next exclusion, it's talking about anything that gets converted. So an apartment building, let's say it got constructed in 2012, and for whatever reasons, they decided they now want to convert this to, I don't want to go to the next slide yet, but they convert this to a common ownership situation where it's condominium. That may then limit any coverage. You can go back. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. This may limit any coverage that that building had as an apartment building. It may not now be covered when they converted it to a condominium. So sometimes these exclusions are on the same policy. Some, they may have 2 or 3 versions of residential exclusions. So you have to read through all of the exclusions to understand what that general liability policy will cover, again, for bodily injury and property damage. The next slide, there's again, along the same theme, exclusion for work performed for a condominium association. So for instance, I had a situation where one of my HVAC contractors performed work for a unit owner. They went and did a replacement of their HVAC unit, and there was consequentially there was a leak that was caused by their work a few days later. It wasn't a large claim, but it's in the tens of thousands of dollars. And this exclusion, because they weren't doing the work on behalf of the association, they were doing it on behalf of the unit owner, they were covered for that work. But if they were actually doing like a repair to, let's say, the chiller tower at the top of the condominium, for the condominium board on the chiller tower, that probably more than likely would have been excluded based on this exclusion. And then again, the last one is one of the most common ones we see on most GL policies today, condominium townhome exclusions for new work. So any new condo and townhome exclusion would exclude all work on anything new, but it does give back coverage for work that is considered service or repair, as long as it's not service or repair to the original construction work, which means it was like, part of the warranty, or they had to go out and fix something, the same contractor that did the original construction, the new construction. So like I said, these have become a big issue when hiring someone to, as a subcontractor, to understand the residential exclusion that they have on their policy. Most of the trades have that, but in particular, you see anything with potential for water damage or anything to the exterior of the building, roofing, stucco, masonry, anything, that sometimes electrical contractors, something that's not necessarily going to lead to a large claim, they may not have that exclusion on there. But it's a good thing when you do request a certificate to ask the certificate to read no residential exclusions on the general liability policy. And then what that'll normally do is cause the agent to provide what exclusions actually exist. All right, so we're going to skip, we're going to go to the next exclusion, which is pretty much self-explanatory in terms of the wording on it. Designated work, so excludes something, some type of specific work. In this example, I'm showing this was a roofing contractor and excluded any type of roofing work that they do that contained hot tar work. So they were able to do any type of roofing except something that would include hot tar and torch work. They were actually doing that type of work when they found this in their policy, and we were able to take over their insurance and move them to a policy that provided coverage for that. Some of the other versions of this designated work could be work at an airport, work for an electric utility, work involving welding. It can involve, they could have any type of exclusion on there for certain types of work that they may not have coverage for in the GL policy. It may be something that the insured did a few times 5 years ago and they no longer do, and they want to make sure that they're not going to say, oh, we can do that too. If you really need it done, we'll do it. We try not to do it anymore. So the GL policy, the GL underwriter wants to just make sure they're not going to be doing that type of work anymore. The next one, again, is also self-explanatory. In this one, it's called New York Operations Exclusion. However, we do sometimes see not only New York, but every construction GL policy, almost without exception, is going to have this exclusion. They're not going to cover any work performed in the state of New York. I know for the audience today, that might not be that big an issue, but there sometimes are other states listed. So it'll be listed state operations exclusion, and it'll list like Colorado, Georgia, New York, and Texas. So you do want to look out for if there's some exclusions to where the person you're hired, the company you're hiring, is allowed to work. All right, so the next one, next exclusion we're going to talk about, next slide, please, is the pre-existing damage exclusion. This one's a little bit more nuanced. It's an important exclusion because what basically the insurance company is saying by putting this in the policy is that any work that this company performed prior to that date is not going to be covered by this policy. So again, getting back to the beginning of the presentation, the trigger is bodily injury, property damage, and it has to occur during the policy period. So if they did the work, let's say a year and a half ago, and all of a sudden the actual damage happened today, and they had an exclusion on saying any work done prior to this date, doesn't matter if it happened during our policy or not, we're not covering this claim. So if someone does, if a company that you hire has this exclusion, some work needs to be done to see what they may have coverage for if they worked for you in the past, and if there's going to be coverage in the event of a claim. This happens often. We see this often when someone has to change GL carriers and the new GL carrier is not that comfortable with the work they did in the past. So for instance, let's say they did a lot of new condo work in the past, and now they don't do that. This new insurance company doesn't want to be on the hook for any work that they did previously. So this is more dangerous really to you if you have this on your policy than it is to someone hiring you. So this could leave you exposed such that you had coverage when you built that project, but now this policy, if there's a claim that happens 2 years later, this policy is not going to respond, and that policy that you had 2 years ago when you did the project may or may not respond depending upon what the trigger was. So that's why I said this is a little bit more complicated and nuanced, but this actually is something you have to be on guard for if it's in your policy. All right, the next one is again, an exclusion that you want to be aware of if it's in your policy or if you're hiring someone. It's a work height exclusion. We see this in some contractors that work at, have height exposure, whether it be a roofer, stucco guy, anyone doing work to an building. And just by coincidence, the Barthett Law Firm in their latest monthly newsletter that they do, they actually gave a good example of a claim that I'm going to, if you hadn't read their monthly newsletter, I'm going to explain. So basically what this height exclusion is doing is it's limiting coverage in your policy. It's saying in the first one, you can work up to 144 feet, which was one of my guys. He hardly ever has worked above 12 stories. But if he does have to work above 12 stories, we're going to have to go and get a specific exclusion for that job. So this was okay for him to live with this exclusion. And the one on the right was a prospect I was working on, and he didn't really know that he had this 3-story height exclusion, and he had recently done a project on a 4-story apartment complex. So basically it's saying there's no coverage for bodily injury, property damage if you work above that height. In the Barthett Law Firm newsletter, it actually gave an example. I think it was an HVAC or a plumbing contractor where they did a repair in a condo. I think it was like on the 6th floor. After they left, there was a significant water leak that caused hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of damage. And they had this 3-story height limitation endorsement on their policy. And the carrier denied the claim. And the subcontractor was now going to be on the hook to pay that entire claim out of their own pocket. Obviously, the condo probably had property coverage, so they would, worst case scenario, if you don't get the newsletter, Alex said, just make sure you let him know and he will send it to you. But if you, ever run into this type of limitation, you have to be aware that you could potentially be on the hook for a claim if you worked above that height limitation, because the GL carrier is not going to provide coverage. All right, so we're getting towards the end here. I want to leave some time for questions. The continuous and progressive damage on the next slide, kind of like what it sounds like. So for instance, and this is a very common exclusion on most policies, GL policies. For instance, if someone knew about that there was a slight leak on a roof and they just said, oh, it's only a slight leak, and then it turned into something major and there was major property damage to that structure, the carrier, once they send out an adjuster, could wind up seeing the clues that were left that there was, slow and progressive damage, and they may say, we're denying the claim based on this was a condition that everyone knew existed, everyone was aware of it, no one took any action, no one reported it to us, and now we're denying the claim. So that's why it's important, as soon as there's a potential claim, which is one of the conditions in a GL policy, is to report, at least for notice, that there's a potential condition that could lead to a claim. The next exclusion is a wrap-up exclusion. I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with the term wrap-up or OSIP, owner-controlled insurance program, or contractor-controlled insurance program, or CSIP. But basically, all GL policies will exclude coverage for anything that's covered under a wrap-up or an insurance program that's intended to cover a specific project. So for instance, all of these large condo buildings that you see going up in Miami Beach, those are usually done under a wrap-up. The GL policy isn't going to provide coverage, except sometimes there may be some limited, what is referred to as off-site coverage that was not a bodily injury or property damage caused at that location of the project. So that's a common exclusion, not anything unusual. The next to the last one I'm going to talk about is EFIS. Again, this is a type of construction that used to be more common. It still occasionally is done for decorative purposes. It involves usually exterior decorative, but there is some structural EFIS that is out there, and all GL policies will exclude this. There are some ways to purchase coverage for EFIS if this is something that you do perform, either under a pollution policy or under a standalone policy for this. But this is, again, something that's going to be excluded under all GL policies for construction. And then the last thing I wanted to just go over in a little bit more depth was what I originally spoke about with pollution. So this total, next page, please. This total pollution exclusion is, again, on most contracted GL policies. So what this does is it adds an additional exclusion to that first one I showed you that's common to all GL policies, and it basically excludes any pollution event under any conditions. Sometimes there'll be an asterisk for a hostile fire, but this is the most common exclusion that's on most policies. And the intent of this is that if you have a pollution exposure, so sometimes that may be obvious, you're bringing chemicals onto a job site or pollutants onto a job site. Sometimes not as obvious. It could be an HVAC contractor and you're installing ductwork or working on duct work, and that may cause some type of irritant to be propelled into the air after you leave the job site or while you're working, and cause someone to get sick due to that irritant or claim they got sick. And that actually could be covered under pollution policy, but it's going to be excluded under your GL policy almost in all circumstances. So the intent, again, of this exclusion is for, if you have the exposure of pollution, is to purchase that coverage. And then the last thing is kind of related to the pollution. It just goes a little bit, next slide, fungi and bacteria. It goes and explains the meaning of fungi, bacteria, mold, and what's not covered under the GL policy. Some may actually have a slight limit for this, but in general, if you have a mold exposure where you're working with, some type, you're in the trade where you have, potential exposure where it could lead to mold development, then you're going to be better off purchasing, you're going to have to purchase the coverage on a pollution policy because it's excluded under your GL policy. So I know we are almost out of time. I hope I was able to explain all of these exclusions that we see most often on contractors' GL policies, and see if we have some questions.
Nope, no other questions except for me, Phil. So what is the best way when you are getting a new policy, a new GL policy, or renewing your policy to make sure that you're getting the necessary coverage? Is there something that all of us should be doing with our agents and brokers to make sure we're not just paying less, but actually paying what we need to pay to get the right coverage?
Correct, Alex. There's something that you should be doing on a regular basis, which is, number one, meeting with your trusted advisor, your agent, your risk advisor, making sure they understand your scope of work, everything that you do, everything that you currently do, anything that you're planning on doing new in the future. Hopefully, you're in contact with them on a regular basis, looking at your contracts, understanding what you are doing that may be either limited or not covered under your GL policy, and explaining to you if there are exclusions that could potentially lead to a gap in coverage, so that you're aware, yeah, okay, I understand that, I'm an HVAC contractor and there could be a potential pollution gap here, but I don't, haven't had those. Those are the comments I get from people when I explain to them, that you may have a gap here. I've never had that happen, but, you have to try and explain to them that's because, you haven't had this situation where someone may, either actually get bodily injuries, sickness caused by a contaminant, or they're claiming they did. So yeah, meet with your agent, your trusted advisor, make sure that they are taking the time to understand what you're doing and how that interacts with the coverage that you're purchasing. And like you said, the lowest premium isn't always the best, because that exclusion, for instance, that roofing contractor had with the HVAC contract that had with the 3-story limitation, probably reduced the premium by $3,000, $5,000. I don't know what their premium was, but they probably got some type of reduction in premium because the GL underwriter was able to put that exclusion on there. And they're like, oh, I'm going to purchase this lower price policy. Little did they know that now they're in a $500,000 suit with the condo association to get repaid for the damage that the GL carrier said went on the hook for.
Yeah, penny wise, pound foolish, right?
Right.
Phil, thank you very much for taking the time. As I said at the beginning, we will send everyone that registered a copy of the PowerPoint, as well as a video of today's presentation and Phil's contact information. So if you have any other questions, you can reach out to Phil directly. Again, thank you for the CFMA Miami chapter. In the chat, I included a link to their website. So if you want to learn more about that group and how it may benefit you, please do. Our next event is virtual, May 19th at noon. 5 things to consider before renting a piece of equipment. We're going to have the folks from Trekker Tractor talk about the things you should consider before you rent a backhoe, forklift, excavator, so that you make sure that you have the necessary knowledge before you undertake that transaction. And we're still shooting for September 15th with Peter Zalewski as our first back in-person live event at the conference center. We will be live streaming that event when we have it. So those of you that are not able to attend or not in the Miami-Dade County area, because this pandemic has allowed us actually to get some folks from all over the country attending the Miami Construction Forum. You'll still be able to watch it. Again, we'll have monthly events all the way through, but September 15th is the goal to have the next live event. Phil, thank you again very much for taking the time and sharing your expertise.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful afternoon, everybody.
Bye-bye.